Welcome to Frankly Speaking. My name is Onkgopotse JJ Tabani. Tonight we are not live, but we're coming to you from Johannesburg here, the SABC in Auckland Park. We continue our conversation with the Minister of Public Enterprises. If you've missed that last week's show, it is there on SABC News Online, and you can catch it there to make sure that we can make sense of tonight's conversation. We continue the conversation by focusing on what entities, these state-owned entities, can do to support black economic empowerment, to support small and medium enterprises. Last week, the minister reflected on what he sees as some of the difficulties that are facing the SOEs. He mentioned issues of management, competent management, issues of governance, you know, how boards conduct themselves, what kind of people must serve on these boards. But of course, also talked about the politics, man. The politics can interfere in the thing, man, and make sure that some of these entities do grind to a little bit of a halt. So we continue that conversation with Minister Pravin Gordhan. Come now, let's go and talk frankly to him. Minister, as we continue the conversation, one of the things that worry South Africans is how state-owned enterprises, particularly as big spenders in our economy, can boost black economic empowerment. Any thoughts on how that we can get that right and refine it a little more going forward?
Well, you know, many of these entities have said in policy terms that that is what they're doing for the last 10 years or so. Secondly, I'm sure there's some very good, genuine experiences in this particular area that we need to build on. And there's absolutely no doubt that smaller businesses, young entrepreneurs, young innovators need to not just get business, but also get support that will enable them to enter the marketplace and create innovative products, but also, more importantly, compete in this particular environment. The second point is that, regrettably, BEE was used as a cover in certain instances to actually mask the fact that billions of rands have in fact been stolen from these entities. And instead of strengthening the hand of young black business people or black businesses in general, it has actually provided, you know, money into the foreign accounts of a few people. Now, we've got to go back to, if you like, genuine black economic empowerment and make sure that we multiply the number of businesses that actually get involved and help the public, and this is the key role for the SABC, help the public to distinguish between fake news and fake narratives on the one hand and real benefits for South Africans on the other hand.
Talking about real benefits, one of the biggest issues for black business, and black business organizations have raised this many times with SOEs directly, but also with the Treasury, is this whole, what you can call procurement regime, where you go to an SOE, you are undercut by somebody, and then they go with the price, but somebody who has been in business forever, who can be able to cross-subsidize, you know, that kind of bid and so on, ends up getting the business. Can you address me on why there was not a sense of urgency in changing that procurement regime in order to boost black economic empowerment?
No, the procurement regime has been undergoing change all the time for the last 10 years or so. And certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been lots of discussions with representative organizations, lots of amendments to the rules of procurement as well. And at the same time, we must make sure that we don't fall foul of another problem, which is that I act as a middle person for you to buy a laptop, which you can go to a retailer, for example, and get for 10,000. But I will add 10,000 and charge you 20,000. Now, that middle person role is something that we need to also eliminate.
Otherwise called tenderpreneurship.
Yeah, because you're adding to the costs at the end of the day. And we might have a group of people making money out of this, but we're not going to compete with other African countries or other developing countries, or indeed other developed countries, if we don't really have sharpshooting young entrepreneurs and older entrepreneurs as well, who understand what competition means in this rough world.
But this whole tender system, it seems to be the bane of our existence right now. I mean, I remember a few years ago, you had to intervene in Limpopo. By the way, a lot of people sometimes not sure what the intentions were, because a similar intervention didn't happen, say, in the Eastern Cape government. Can you just give me a sense of what interventions you can make on if refining the tender system, not to disadvantage small businesses, right, or not to over-advantage those who are taking a chance?
I think we'll have to sit, both our department and the National Treasury again, look at what has worked in the last 5 or so years, listen carefully to what genuine entrepreneurs need at this point in time. And remember that, as I said earlier on, it's not just about giving a tender. In many instances in South Africa, we need to create the support systems. So
to make sure those businesses can actually implement once they are given that
implement,
business. Yes.
thrive, learn the skills, and learn how to compete in a rough environment as well, and enter into clever partnerships that will enable them to actually survive. So give us a few months. We'll look at this particular issue, listen carefully, and look at what adaptations need to be made, but also set up higher levels of transparency, so that you can't fake these transactions as has been done. It would actually appear. Now, in this kind of context, I also want to make an appeal, using your channel as an opportunity, to the really honest people who are the majority in most of these entities. They are genuine South Africans who want to earn a decent living, support their families, and do an honest day's work. And it's time for them to speak up. It's time for them to expose those who've been really involved. And we'll try to set up a mechanism which will enable them to give us proof about who has been up to what kind of malfeasance, so that it'll help government clean up much faster if we actually know where to target our attention. And to those, as I said, who know that they've been doing the wrong thing and benefiting from these exercises, own up. Because sooner or later,
they can save us money for all these inquiries.
Absolutely.
One of the biggest things that people are worried about is how small businesses are actually squeezed out of existence by some of the big enterprises. Because, if a big entity which is multi-billion owes a small company something, they can go to court forever, keep you in court for years on end. And as if that was not enough, then we had Eskom pay a big company millions in advance, right?
Billions.
In the middle of a PFMA that actually disallows that.
Yes.
Right? What balance can be struck? Because if a small business actually has the capacity to implement a project but doesn't have the capital, surely it's what is done at Eskom, if it wasn't done for bad purposes, would not have been a bad thing to do to boost a small business, say, here is capital, go and implement.
I think the new board of Eskom will have to look at that whole procurement regime, particularly because the bulk of the procurement budget is actually spent on coal, because that's the main supply that they actually require in order to do their business. And what you're referring to is an instance where a well-established black firm, it was big, that's fine, but it was a black-owned firm, was marginalized, penalized. 1,500 workers lost their jobs as a result, in order that a Gupta-related firm or set of firms would be positioned, despite the fact that they had very little money, to actually take over these 2 mines that are today in the news. And what you're talking about is an advance of a guarantee of 1.6 billion rands by the former CFO, and another advance of almost 600 million rands in cash, which very politely before the parliamentary committee was called prepayment.
Yes.
And when you look at the facts, there's no such thing as prepayment.
That's allowed. That's allowed.
That's allowed in
I want to focus a little more on the Eskom inquiry, because in a way, one way or another, it's almost a sample, essentially, of what is going on in our state on the press. So I want to focus a little bit about what are the big themes you've picked up from that inquiry, and therefore what can we learn from it. We're talking to Minister Gordhan, who's the Minister of Public Enterprises. The second part of a conversation that we started with him last week. You can follow our show on #FranklySpeaking. After the break, we continue that conversation.
Bill of Rights is the cornerstone of democracy. It enshrines the rights of all people in our country and affirms the democratic values of human dignity. Watch the live broadcast on SABC News Channel 404 and SABC2 on the 21st of March.
Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. My name is JJ Tabani. We're coming to you from Auckland Park here in Johannesburg, and my guest tonight is the Minister of Public Enterprise. This is the second segment of the conversation we started with him last week. Minister, the Eskom inquiry, I mean, quite apart from all the dramatics, you know, what are the big themes, right, that you're picking up out of that inquiry that would help you to say these are the things we need to fix going forward, particularly focusing on the management of public finances, because that's the biggest thing that's worrying people?
Well, the inquiry was in a sense a diagnostic. It helped us to understand what was going wrong. So if you turn that into a set of objectives that we now need to achieve, which the President set out in the State of the Nation address, it's firstly change the boards. Secondly, ensure that the right governance rules apply. For example, there was a creeping role of boards in the procurement process, right? And as you correctly pointed out, if you have a conflict of interest, that's the last thing you want to get involved in. You want some technical process that will ensure that procurement happens the right way. Secondly, make sure that the management team is one that practices good ethics, has proven integrity, and above all is a combination of known skills and training people to occupy positions like that in the future, because we're not going to find everybody who's perfectly developed in this. But at the same time, if we don't have the right skills and the right professionalism in these institutions, we'll also be making a mistake. The third thing is obviously finances, as you point out. Over a period of time, hopefully sooner rather than later, these entities must no longer be a burden on the public finances of the country. Right? In fact, they should be supplying dividends if they were run as efficient businesses. So we'll have to look at
with Telkom. You know, I mean, Telkom, that model seems to work, where you don't put everything, you know, as a responsibility of the state, but you know, some kind of private involvement ensures that you can generate the profit. Which brings me to my other question: is your posture for SOEs that they must be profit making, or not? Because there are a lot of people who say, no, this shouldn't make a profit. I mean, like SAA, you know, in a normal business environment, you'd have been shut down long ago. You know, no single shareholder can stomach that kind of multi-billion loss over decades.
Sure. No, profit making might be a misleading statement, but you want them to be commercially sound. So if you are supplying a service to business, you want to make sure that you cover your costs for a start. And that's the only way you're not going to rely on somebody else to supply you with money to cover your costs. Secondly, you got to, as the President was saying, you got to have an operating or business model that ensures that you are sustainable. And if you're not sustainable, then make the changes that are necessary, both through consultation in government and within the boards themselves, to change the business model over a period of time. And thirdly, continue to play the developmental mandate. Remember that for many, many years now, the state-owned entities, particularly Eskom and Transnet, were the biggest investors in infrastructure from a government point of view. So over each 3-year cycle that I've been aware of, about R1 trillion was spent in infrastructure. 80% of that, if not more, came from these two institutions. And the country still requires investment in infrastructure, but you cannot have exploding costs. So something that's worth 20 billion today, next year becomes 40 billion, right? Either through incompetence, mismanagement, or manipulation. So those are things that we've got to watch carefully.
But some of those big picture stuff have to do with politics. So a minister who's in charge of SAA, for example, right? And SAA being the flavor of the month in this one, right? If he's told, look, we have to fight, we don't need 13,000 people working for SAA. This is inefficient, right? They would then think about, oh, now I'll be seen to have, you know, cut jobs and what have you. What should be the balance between the politics and that kind of commercial viability in your view? Secondly, what would you say about the role of ministers? We have seen a situation where ministers, you know, go over the board to appoint a CEO. In other words, they impose a CEO on the board that must see that CEO, that must oversee that CEO's work. Would your view be that the ministers must let the board do the appointing of the executives and they simply just make sure that there's accountability, Minister?
Provided that you have good independent boards that understand the business. You've seen the kind of history that we've had with boards and their appointments. So yes, that's the first thing. Secondly, the current practice is that boards advertise, boards interview, and boards submit 3 names to a minister who takes a recommendation to cabinet, and cabinet ultimately makes the decision, which can in fact be reversed as well if some members or all of cabinet is not happy with that environment. Secondly, I think over time we'll have to develop a political code as well. But you cannot leave these institutions to actually run on their own. Certainly, probably for the next few years, because in order to achieve both the developmental objectives, the economic objectives, and making sure that you achieve sustainability within those institutions, you're going to need a very competent department and proper political oversight, not necessarily by one individual, because we also have a council of ministers that was set up a while ago that will become operational under President Ramaphosa.
It's like an IMC of some kind that would look at
all of the performance factors,
state-owned entities. But would you argue then for a more hands-on approach by the cabinet into SOEs rather than leave the boards to do their thing once those boards are credible? And I'm raising this because there's also an issue about what we call deployment, political deployment, cadre deployment. Right? How do you how do you assure investors, right, in that regard that this deployment is not a blind deployment where the whole political interference continues even if you are trying to create a new dawn going forward?
Ultimately, your test both within boards and management teams is, can you do the job? Do you have the competence? And are we providing all of the balances that are required in terms of racial composition, affirmative action, gender equity, and getting the balance right, as I said, between experienced and not so experienced people, so that you grow a new crop of people in South Africa who serve on boards or serve on these management teams. And you want a culture ultimately to develop in the country where youngish professionals who've worked in the private sector, develop their core skills, come into state institutions for 5 or 7 years, and then go back and make as much money as they like in the private sector. But that public service needs to become part of the ethic and the approach that young professionals or not so young professionals need to use. And that's a goal that all of us should seek to achieve.
There's been a huge culture in these institutions of, first of all, huge turnover. Right? And you've mentioned there about professionals being afraid to go there and so on. And one of the big questions is whether or not the salaries that are paid by executives at these institutions must match those of the private sector or not. Others are saying, well, they must match those of the public sector. In other words, if somebody is a DDG at the Department of Transport, you send them to PRASA, do they then earn 10 times the salary and so on? So I want, after the break, for us to talk a little bit about how do we fix the culture at these institutions of remuneration and of turnover of staff. We are on Frankly Speaking. We're talking to Minister Gordhan about the state of public enterprises and what he intends to do to fix it all. Join us again after the break to continue that conversation.
Yes, yes.
Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m.
Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. We're rounding off that conversation with the Minister of Public Service, Public Enterprises, Minister Gordhan. Minister, the culture at SO is one culture of turnover. So a new minister comes, new board, new CEO, and so it goes, and then people's futures are left in the balance. And then this issue of the culture where SOEs are paid way above other civil servants, how can we sort that? Can you give me an answer just to deal with both those two issues related to the culture of these SOEs?
I think in respect of both those cultures, firstly, we need a new culture in the country, which says that public service is an important part of any professional's life. And that, as I said, for X number of years, each of us should be very proud to say, I've served in a public institution, and in fact, it's good to have that on my CV, because the next job I go to, that will be an important point of recognition. Secondly, as you correctly point out, we need a remuneration policy which ensures that we don't become as extravagant as, say, financial institutions, and sometimes not as conservative as the public sector might be. So I think we need to, there is a policy paper in this regard. The details are still being worked through. But the third point is that we also need consequence management. In other words, we've had many instances where large bonuses have been paid, but
when in fact the thing is making losses.
Yeah, either you're making losses, you've messed up a big infrastructure project, or your operations are masked by manipulating different parts of the business in order for your overall numbers to look good. So we come back to getting the right skills in oversight departments, in parliament, in the public space, because NGOs and civil society have shown that they play a very important part in all of this. And that mix, I think, over the next year, 18 months, will begin to generate the right kind of culture if we have goodwill on all sides. And we require the cooperation of people who are currently within state-owned entities as well.
You see yourself as an activist, and a lot of people, washed you in awe over the last year, right, after you've been fired by the previous president, that you kept your head up and you continue to hold other officials accountable, etc. Will you do the same activism if this president messes up like the previous one did?
Well, give the new president a chance. He's hardly been in office. So all of us, all of us in public institutions, but indeed in private institutions as well. You've had big companies whose leaders have really messed up, and shareholders have lost. But
I'm addressing a big man syndrome, Minister. You failed, you guys, as the leadership, to call President Zuma to order for a decade. I mean, he messed up in his first year of office. And what people want to know is, are we going to see more of the same, but different script, because there's a new sheriff in town, or this 10 years taught us that we've got to kill the culture of what I call acquiescence, where we're just saying, oh, this is the president wants this, let's do it.
Acquiescence doesn't help, and overall submission doesn't help. And remember, what happens in certain organizations or structures of organizations often doesn't become publicly known. So to accuse everybody of acquiescence is wrong. Different individuals, I won't name them,
played different roles
and have opposed wrong things, have challenged wrong things. So one example is the Treasury taking the Guptas to, or the matter of whether bank accounts can be closed or not to the court. That decision had to be made to protect one's own integrity.
Anything you regret, though? I mean, you are a powerful Minister of Finance. You failed to get rid of somebody like Dudumien, who obviously needed to be fired. Did you have to balance the politics with the practicality of just replacing her?
No, but if you look at that whole period, we actually had a stalemate for 8-9 months.
Not appointing a new chairperson?
Not appointing a new board.
At all, yes.
Right, and eventually the compromise was that she can stay for 1 year, for 1 year, but the entire board was changed.
And then afterwards, she was appointed an advisor to a minister of transport. This kind of thing where people get shifted from one place to go and mess up another side. Absolutely. Are you going to clamp down on that at SOE?
I'm sure. The Ramaphosa era is going to introduce many changes, I believe. Yes. And amongst those are all these kinds of fault lines that we've had. And we must be frank, that for a while, whether we were outside of the government structures or inside of the government structures, we couldn't understand all the chess moves that were being made.
Joining the dots, as you always say.
I didn't want to say it myself. I'm glad you've said it.
Your party in short?
No, I think there's a fantastic future ahead of us. The new dawn is a serious occurrence in our country. But to make it happen, we're going to require a maximum unity of purpose amongst all of us and give each other a chance to do the right things, but above all, support the right things and make sure that the wrong things don't happen again.
Wonderful. Minister Gordhan, wishing you all the best with the work that you have to do. And thank you again for being here for my guest tonight.
Thank you very much.
That was Frankly Speaking, coming to you from Auckland Park at the SABC. If you want to follow that conversation, hashtag Frankly Speaking, you can tweet us at SABC Online as well as at JJ Tabane. Until we talk frankly again, may God bless you.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.